Good morning. Please open your Bibles to Gospel of John, chapter 10. John, chapter 10. We're going to continue to answer this question that affects all of our lives of why should we believe in Jesus? And we've been looking at different pictures in John's Gospel of the illustrations that Jesus gives for who he is and what he can do. He is the light of the world, or he can provide living water, or he is the bread of life. And so we've been unpacking those pictures to get at the real meaning that is behind them. And what we're going to do during the time that we have right now is look at this picture that he paints of himself as a shepherd. He shepherds with goodness is what he will tell the disciples and the people who are opposed to him in John chapter 10. So I'd like to read with you from this passage as we start. John chapter 10, verse 1, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfolds by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand that he was saying what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up. This charge I have received from my Father." When you think of the word leadership, what automatically comes to your mind? What is a leader in the eyes of our culture, in the eyes of many people around us? Well, a leader in our society is usually thought of as a very important high-up official or person in a government or an organization. A leader is a CEO of a large corporation who has armies of secretaries and people under him that he is managing, and he's got the corner office over here separated from everybody else, or he's got Secret Service to protect him. He is a president of a country, or he is a very important person in some respect. But according to the scriptures, that's not what God pictures as a leader. A true leader is not a big shot who is telling everybody else what to do and is calling all the shots. A leader, in the way that the Bible pictures him, is what Jesus is as a shepherd. Someone who's not separated from the people, but who has a very close relationship with them, just as a shepherd does with his own sheep. Have you ever noticed how in the Bible, the great leaders of the scriptures are often shepherds? Who is the one that God called out of Ur the Chaldees to form a nation from him? Abraham was a shepherd, and his son and his grandson, and so on and so forth. They were nomadic wanderers. They pitched their tents out in the desert, and they were shepherds. They were keepers of animals and sheep. You think about Moses. What did he do for 40 years after he left the palace in Egypt, growing up as Pharaoh's daughter's adopted son? He spent 40 years out in the wilderness keeping sheep. What was David? Before David became king over Israel and lived in a palace and managed the people of God. He was a shepherd. The youngest son of his father Jesse. A nobody. Think about the prophet Amos, who was from the city of Tekoa in Israel. He was a shepherd before God took him and put him in the places of power to speak to people who were abandoning God. You have shepherds listed and pictured all over the scriptures, and Jesus uses this picture for himself. He shows us here that if you believe in him, he can gently guide you. He can give you direction in your life that all of us really want. And he can keep you safe. So I want to, before we talk about John 10, I just briefly want to talk with you a little bit about what the Old Testament pictures in terms of shepherds. What we often see, and there's a couple of scriptures that show this here, when you look at the Old Testament, you'll find that kings and their people were often compared to shepherds and their sheep. And 2 Samuel 5 is one of those places. For the sake of time, I'll just launch right there. In 2 Samuel 5, in verse 1 and 2, it says this, "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel." Those are shepherding terms right there. "And the Lord said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." In 2 Samuel 5, David is just now starting to come into his kingship. He's been anointed by Samuel a long time before that place in 2 Samuel 5, but he's been in a war with Saul. Saul's been running after him for years, trying to kill him. And now Saul is dead, and his son Jonathan, and David is now going to take the throne and take control over the people. But Israel comes to David here, and you notice what they say to him. Even when Saul was our king, we realized that you were the true leader. You were the one who was leading the people in and out, and you were the one who was shepherding, which was according to God's promise. In 1 Kings 22, that's a passage that describes Ahab going to war with King Jehoshaphat of Judah. They're going to go up and they're going to fight the Syrians. And at the last minute, King Jehoshaphat, who fears God, Ahab definitely does not, Jehoshaphat pipes up and says, we really need to ask God about this business of going to war just to make sure he's fine with this, make sure we have his will on our side. And so Ahab calls together 400 prophets of Baal, and they tell him what they know he wants to hear. And then after that, Jehoshaphat says, well, we really need a prophet of the Lord. So Micaiah is brought in. He is totally sarcastic in what he says, and he tells these kings about a vision that he has seen. How the shepherd of the sheep of Israel was going to be struck down, and the sheep were going to be scattered. The master of the people would fall. And so Ahab is pictured as a shepherd of his sheep in that passage. And when we also think about shepherds in the Old Testament, we find this being mentioned too. That Jewish leaders, if they were bad, if they were unrighteous, they were often pictured as bad shepherds who did not take care of the sheep. In fact, in Zechariah chapter 11, you see an illustration of this. Zechariah 11, beginning in verse 15, it says this, "And the Lord said to me, take once more the equipment of a foolish shepherd." So dress up like a shepherd, Zechariah. "For behold, I'm raising up in the land a shepherd who does not care for those being destroyed, or seek the young, or heal the maimed, or nourish the healthy, but devours the flesh of the fat ones, tearing off even their hooves. Woe to my worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. Let his arm be wholly withered and his right eye utterly blinded." You know, Zechariah was a prophet that was preaching during the days of the time when Israel got to go back home during the time of the Persians. But things, even though the exile was officially over, things were not great among the Jews. And you still had leaders, even after those 70 years of punishment, you still had Jewish leaders who were not what they should have been, who were just taking advantage of the poor people who were under them and fleecing them and eating them, so to speak, and taking advantage of them instead of taking care of them. And so Zechariah says in chapter 9, there is a king, a good king who is coming. He's going to be riding on a donkey, and of course he's talking about Jesus who's going to come. But Jesus isn't here yet. And right now in Zechariah's time, you've got these bad shepherds, and so God says, I'm going to judge them. I'm going to strike their arm. I'm going to strike their right eye. They're going to be blinded. And, you know, yesterday when we were talking about John 9 and John 10, you know, Jesus is talking to Pharisees who are blind. They claim to be able to see and understand, but Jesus says, no, you're blind. And so he's thinking about this passage in Zechariah 10, where you've got blind shepherds who cannot take care of the people. And in Ezekiel chapter 34, here's another passage that talks about shepherds over the people who are not what they should be. In Zechariah 34, verse 1, the word of the Lord came to me, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord, Ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. So they were scattered, because there was no shepherd, and they become food for all the wild beasts. My sheep were scattered, they wandered over all the mountains, and on every high hill, and my sheep were scattered over all the face of the earth, with none to search or seek for them." You know, I don't know if you have much experience with sheep. I certainly don't. But I know enough about sheep to know that they are in trouble if they don't have some human person to watch over them. You know, sheep are not very intelligent animals, and unlike some animals that have big teeth or big claws or have a gas that they can shoot out of their body to ward off predators, sheep are pretty defenseless animals. They don't have a lot of things to attack or to defend themselves with. And if a lion or a wolf or a bear wants to have them as a breakfast snack, there's not much they can do about that. They're not even very fast. And so these Israelites, God says, they are utterly defenseless if they don't have somebody over them who's helping them and taking care of them. They've got broken bones. They're wandering over the countryside looking for leadership, and they can't find it in you. In Ezekiel is talking to the leaders of his generation. And so the Jews, when Jesus comes along in John chapter 10 and says, I am the good shepherd, they knew their Bibles, and they read about passages in the Old Testament where there were not good shepherds. There were bad shepherds. And so Jesus is making a contrast between the leaders in Zechariah and Ezekiel's time and anywhere else you find bad shepherds, and saying, I'm not like that. If you follow me, I'm not going to take advantage of you. I'm not going to lead you down bad paths. I'm going to actually care for your needs. I'm going to give you that guidance that you want. And when we look at the Old Testament, we see that God, and Jesus was God, is God. God is pictured as a good shepherd of his people. If you just go in that passage that we just read in Ezekiel 34, look down a little bit later in the context where you see God saying this in verse 22. After he said, I'm gonna get you for not taking care of my people, he says, I will rescue my flock, and they shall no longer be a prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep, and I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. Of course, he's talking about Jesus here. He's not going to resurrect David from the dead and put him as a king again on the throne of Israel. He's going to bring the son of David, who will be born from his family, who will then become the new king, Jesus. And he says, verse 24, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, and I have spoken. And I think all of us also are very familiar with a psalm that David wrote. Psalm 23, where David begins that psalm by saying, the Lord is my shepherd. And because of that, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Now you think about David's life. Did that really describe David's life? Did David have a very calm, peaceful, luscious life? No, he spent years running away from a maniac person who wanted to kill him and who routinely liked to throw spears at his head. And his wife was given away to somebody else. Those of you guys who are married, how would you like that? If your father-in-law just said, no, okay, your wife's going to belong to that man now. I would not care for that at all. And even after he became king, when he sinned with Bathsheba, the whole rest of his life, there was war. His son after son after son rose up against him or committed some terrible act, raping another one of his children, and then dies. I mean, he doesn't have this peaceful life. But he writes Psalm 23, not because he's lying through his teeth. He does look at his life that way, not because everything is perfectly great in his life, but because the Lord is his leader. The Lord is his shepherd. And the Lord can lead him to peaceful places spiritually, even though his physical situation doesn't always look like that. He does have green pastures. He does have still waters. He does have what he needs. The Lord is taking care of them. And remember, he says in that psalm, goodness shall follow me all the days of my life. Jesus is tapping into all this when he says, I am the good shepherd. Now, what makes Jesus a good shepherd? Let's go to our passage in John 10. Let's look at several points in the time that we've got left. Notice verse 3 again with me. Verse 3 of John chapter 10, to him, in this picture that Jesus is painting for us, to him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. I want you to keep in mind, again, as we read John 10, just remember that even though we've got a chapter break between 9 and 10, this is not a new thought. Jesus is not in an entirely different situation than he was back in chapter 9. Remember, chapter 9 is when he heals a guy who was born blind, could not see his entire life, and he heals him on the Sabbath day. And there's this whole big argument between him and the Pharisees, because they hate that he's doing that on the Sabbath, and they claim he's a false teacher, and the man sticks to his guns, and he gets thrown out. But then Jesus finds him, and he worships him. But at the end of chapter 9, there's some Pharisees over here who are overhearing his conversation with this man, and they're turning to Jesus, and the Pharisees are saying, oh, okay, so do you think we're blind? You think we can't see? And Jesus basically says, yeah, that's exactly what your situation is. In chapter 9, verse 41, if you were blind, you have no guilt, but now that you say, we see, your guilt remains. That's the same crowd that he gives this picture to. Of, I'm the good shepherd, but you guys, you Pharisees, you're the thieves, you're the robbers, you're the people who are not taking care of the sheep like you ought to be doing. But this blind man that he heals, he hears the voice of the Good Shepherd, and he followed it, didn't he? Remember when Jesus meets him, he can't see Jesus. He can only hear his voice. And Jesus says, okay, I'm going to put mud on your eyes. Just, if you think about it, it's a really weird thing to do to somebody. I mean, I guess if you're going through a spa treatment, I mean, maybe mud or cucumbers or funky things on your eyes would make sense. But this is not that kind of situation. The guy is lying by the side of the road, and Jesus just slathers him with mud on his eyes and says, yeah, go down to the pool and wash. He hears the voice, and he obeys. And he does it, and as a result, he can see. You know, I'm not a shepherd, and I have almost zero experience with sheep, but I have read about shepherds who can do this, who have such a close relationship with these little animals, with white puffy coats, who bleat and are so defenseless and dependent on that person. What they can do is, if they're out in a field with a whole bunch of other shepherds and a whole bunch of other sheep, they can just whistle or call or do their little thing, and their sheep will hear him and come out of this huge flock of sheep and follow him out, because they're familiar with who he is. And they know what his voice sounds like, and they obediently come to him without question, without any doubt, trusting that he is the one who takes care of them. That's what love is. In verse 3, Jesus knows them, leads them out. This is such a beautiful relationship of Jesus's relationship with his people. You know, half the time that Jesus taught things, the apostles had no idea what he was saying. But you remember, the apostles always followed Jesus. In fact, in chapter 11, in the second hour this morning, we're going to talk about chapter 11 and the raising of Lazarus from the dead. You remember what Thomas says after Jesus says, you know, we're going to go back down to Judea, to the place where they tried to kill us, and we're going to go visit Lazarus' family. And the apostles tried to argue, no, we can't go back to Judea. That's where we almost died. And Jesus says, no, we're going back. And remember what Thomas says? Thomas is often pictured as a doubter. And he was in the time of the resurrection. But in John 11, he says to the rest of them, let us also go that we may die with him. They didn't know why Jesus was going back down. Lazarus is already dead. Well, what are we going to do? I mean, there's nothing to do for that situation. But they heard his voice, and they knew he was their shepherd, and they just went. They just trusted him, and they went. Do we have that kind of trust in Jesus? When you read something in the scriptures that doesn't quite agree with you, and you don't know why God wrote it that way, and you don't understand what that's doing in the Bible, do you listen to it and just obey without question? Understanding that even if I don't get all the answers, he's the shepherd, and I'm the sheep, And he understands what I need. I need to obey, and I need to follow him. Also, you notice in verse 9, Jesus leads his sheep to nourishing places, where he says in verse 9, I'm the door. If anyone enters by me, then he's going to be saved. And then he's going to go in and out and find pasture. Again, that's what David says in Psalm 23. He leads me beside still waters. He leads me to green pastures. And have you ever noticed in Mark chapter 6, when Jesus is about to multiply bread and fish to feed these thousands of people who have come to him, in Mark chapter 6, in verse 39, it says that he made the crowd sit down on the green grass. Why would Mark tell us about the grass color of the place where the multitude sat down in? Why would he tell us about green grass? It's because he's talking about the picture in Psalm 23. He leads me into green pastures. This is what Jesus does. He takes us to places that are good for us to be in. But, if you've been suffering in your life, and if you've been having physical pain, or if you've had a disease, or if you've had a loved one pass, or if something has happened to you, does it really look like this is happening in your life? No. And again, in the next chapter, when Lazarus dies, chapter 11, and Mary and Martha approach Jesus and they're heartbroken, and they're sad, and they're crying their eyes out. It doesn't look like this for them. But Jesus keeps saying to them, no, you're going to see the glory of God. We need to trust that Jesus understands how to protect us. He calls himself, in that verse, in verse 9, he calls himself the door. What shepherds would frequently do is for the night, they would pen their sheep up in enclosed areas with a fence around them, maybe in a cave, something like that, and they themselves would lie across the entrance to that enclosed area so that they would know during the night if anything came over them to get into the area to get the sheep. They would understand that was going on, and they would also know if a sheep tried to get out. And so this is a very tender picture of protection here. And so this is why Jesus says so many different times in the Gospels to lean on me, rely on me. Don't worry about your life. I've got that. Just think about the kingdom of God and how to accomplish his righteousness. And all these things that you need in your life, your food, your clothing, what you need to drink. The Gentiles, that's what they pursue in their life. That's their whole concern. But you need to have a different focus. Don't worry about all that stuff. I know that you need that. I created you to need food and water and clothing. And so don't pursue that in your life and exclude me. I can take care of you. So we have a larger purpose that we're working for. And something that is so comforting to me about this passage also is that Jesus says that his purpose for us is to give. In his relationship with us, his purpose is to give instead of take. Remember, he said in Matthew 20:28, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom. The job of a shepherd was not a very high up status symbol. If you were a shepherd, you were not looked at as this person who occupied this great position in society. Did you know that it was often the youngest sons of a family who would become the shepherd of sheep? That's why David is the youngest son of Jesse. Out of all those sons, he's the one out in the field when Samuel comes to Jesse's house. And all of Jesse's sons line up, and he goes one by one. God says, nope, that's not the king, that's not the king, that's not the king. And David's just an afterthought. Remember that? Jesse doesn't even bother to call him in. And Samuel said, well, do you have any more sons? Well, yeah, we got that one more son who's out there in the field. We can call him in if you like. And that's the one that the Lord chose. So shepherding was not like driving a BMW, everybody looking at you thinking, oh, you're a rich person with a high status symbol. No, this is a job of service, a lowly and sometimes lonely job. But a good shepherd is completely focused. If he is going to occupy this lowly job, he's going to be focused on what he can do for these animals, how he can serve them. He would often do things that were unpleasant to most other people in society. He would often, what shepherds would do, they wouldn't go out with the sheep and then just come in into the house, into their cozy beds for the night. They would frequently spend 24/7 with the sheep. All the time, at night, during the day, in frost, in the heat. They would spend, no matter what the weather was, time of day, they're out there with those animals. At least when we do our jobs, as hard as our jobs might be sometimes, we can at least go home and get away from the workplace for a while before we have to go back again. Just imagine being a shepherd, and that is your life. Your whole life is being with those animals. And in Palestine, where water was very scarce, what a shepherd might do is he might spend hours trying to look for a place that had water. Because the sheep cannot live very long without some kind of water supply. So you bet, if you're a shepherd, you better spend your time trying to find some place to give these animals what they need to have to survive. And so when we translate this to us, we see that Jesus is saying, my purpose for you, and he says this here in this passage, my purpose for you is that you can have life. And not just a little bit of life. Not just enough life for you to get by. I want you to have life and have it abundantly. As much life as you could possibly need. But you know what? Any other shepherd that you could put over you in this life doesn't want to give anything to you. They want to take from you. If you consume the content of pornographic companies on the internet or on your television, they want to take something from you. They don't want to give. They might give you this content, but what they want to take is your time and your money and your vitality and your life and suck you into their world to a point where you will never escape. That's what they want. These companies that produce all these gadgets and gizmos that we enjoy, what they want to take is your money. They want to take you, even if it means going into credit card debt, even if it means destroying your finances. You've got to have that next Apple computer. You've got to have it, because that will make your life special. You got to have that new iPhone. No, we don't. That's not going to be a good shepherd. Only Jesus can do that. Jesus wants you to submit your life to him so that he can give you his own life. Here's another application point along these lines. I really hope that one day this congregation will have elders, because that is God's plan for congregations. And you might know this already, but God calls elders shepherds in the New Testament. 1 Peter 5, they're mentioned with this picture. And it's so crucial. If you're going to be a shepherd over a congregation of God's people, it's so crucial to understand this point, that your purpose is to give and not to take. It is a terrible thing when elders of God's people think that their position is just about getting power over other people. And their position is about getting a status and getting a spiritual gold star on their report card that they can flash around and say, I'm an elder, and you ought to follow me, and that's what it's all about. No, being an elder, being a shepherd, is about a position of service to other people. It's about helping people that you're under to grow closer to God. It's not about throwing your weight around. And I have seen that happen with elders in a congregation, and it is a terrible thing. It divides the people from each other, and it leaves the sheep without a shepherd. And that's not God's plan. If you want to be a shepherd, this is your model, what Jesus does. And finally, verse 10, before we close this up. I have 2 minutes, about 5 minutes. Okay. When we look at verse 10, we see that Jesus sacrifices his safety and comfort for the sheep. You know, shepherds were often armed with slings or stabs or whatnot, because sheep were delicious to animals, and they were valuable to other people who wanted to steal them. And so shepherds, and David talks about this in 1 Samuel 17, that when he was out in the field with his sheep, he did fight off some animals so that they would not consume his animals. But Jesus says that's different from what the hired hand does. He just runs away. The sheep don't belong to him, so he's out of there whenever somebody comes to attack. But Jesus says, no, I'm the good shepherd, and so what that means is I look after my sheep, and in fact, verse 10, I go so far as to verse 11, I lay down my life for the sheep. And nobody is going to take that away from me, he says, in this context. I'm going to lay it down of my own accord and take it up again so that my sheep can be safe. And finally, verse 16, Jesus says, I want more sheep than I already have. This is not just a flock of Jews that I want to sacrifice myself for. I want to have as many sheep as possible. And so there will come a time where I will call them in, and this is such a beautiful big vision for the kingdom that Jesus has. It fulfills the promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, going all the way back to Adam and Eve. God was going to fix the problem of sin. And so what this means for you is that no matter what kind of sheep you are, whether you're a Jew or you're a Gentile, whether you are a person who has committed this kind of sin, or this kind of sin, or this kind of sin, or you have this struggle, or this struggle, or this struggle, no matter who you are, you have a place in Jesus' flock. Regardless of what kind of personality you have, or your hair color, or your body weight, or your age, whatever kind of sheep you are going to have a welcome, and a warm welcome in the family of Jesus. So even if you don't get that from people in the world, you're going to get that inside of God's family, because He wants more sheep. And that's why we're doing the things that we're doing even now, 2,000 years later, is because this gospel is meant to bring in as many people as possible. And so, why should we believe in Jesus? What is He offering you in your life? He's offering to completely provide for your well-being, your safety, your welfare. Everything about Jesus coming to earth was about giving and helping and serving and causing us to see that He truly loves us more than anyone else or anything. And Jesus is often pictured as a shepherd, not just in John 10, but in Hebrews 13, verse 20 and 21. The Hebrew writer says, "Now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good, that you may do His will, working in us that which is pleasing in His sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever." In 1 Peter 2, verse 25, he says, "For you were straying like sheep before you became a Christian, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. In chapter 5 of 1 Peter, in verse 4, he says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory." So let's put our faith and our trust in our life in this good shepherd.